It is now 7:30 in the morning in Tel Aviv, where CNN's Richard Roth has been standing by throughout the night. Richard, what's the latest there?
Susan, we are about to start getting some answers to questions which are very much in the Israeli minds, as well as those of the rest of the world, questions that we have been waiting and wondering about for 5.5 weeks. How will Saddam Hussein's political and military machine bear up under the hammering which at last it is getting? The Israelis have been studying Saddam Hussein more seriously than the rest of the world for a somewhat longer time, and one of the most prominent names in those studies is Amatzia Baram, an Israeli professor who has written a number of books about the Middle East and is a specialist in Saddam Hussein. Good morning, Professor Baram. Thank you for being with us. First of all, I'd like to indulge in a little advance hindsight. Given that some of our objectives are to minimize Kuwaiti and coalition casualties, given that it was not impossible that the coalition could have negotiated a shorter withdrawal time, not impossible, and given that just by abrogating those Security Council resolutions, the West would not have been throwing away its rights to compensation, to war crimes trials, would it not perhaps have been wiser to have waited a little longer and see if the West could have negotiated Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait?
I don't think so. In the first place, we have to bear in mind that Saddam is a master when it comes to dragging his feet. He would have dragged you for I don't know how many months. Secondly, you couldn't possibly allow him to get out from Kuwait with all his equipment, and you couldn't possibly afford to allow him to get off the hook of compensations. The reasons are that if you would do that, you would give him an excellent chance of long-term survival. And his long-term survival would have meant probably a much worse Holocaust within a few years when he would become an atomic superpower. I think he has proven by his threats to burn Israel last April and by his horrible atrocities in Kuwait that he's not worthy to last one day more.
Saddam and his system of power. It's been described in one thing I read as like a spider in the middle of a very complex web where the slightest twitch at the filament at the periphery sets off a swift and deadly strike. Now Saddam Hussein may be in a somewhat different position. How is his system of maintaining power, giving orders, going to be bearing up under what's happening now?
So far it works perfectly inside Iraq. Nothing has been touched so far. His power structure is 100% or 99% intact in Iraq. In Kuwait, the communication is not very good. But you have to bear in mind that he has, it's not a spider, or if it's a spider, it's a kind of, you cut off one of its legs, the leg has got a life of its own. In Kuwait, every army officer, down to the rank of a lieutenant colonel, a battalion commander, has a party security man, an apparatchik, breathing down his neck. These people are responsible directly to Saddam Hussein, which means that even if communications are suffering, are problematic and so on, you still have an immediate problem for army officers who want to rebel or something to deal with these people. It's very difficult. It's not unsurmountable, but it's very difficult, and so far the information is that it works because the army is still in place and more or less ready to fight. When you break the front lines, when you encircle Kuwait, when you break the chain of command, something will happen. But it's too early for that now.
Well, if what you're saying makes it seem a little less likely that even the most brilliant military success by the coalition will bring Saddam down, can you give any prescription militarily for a political victory?
Yes, I can suggest what would be the best course to adopt. I think you are doing it. I hope you are doing it. That's what we understand, at least. You have to entrap his military machine in Kuwait, to seal it off by cutting it off from the mainland, from the Iraqi mainland. Then you have to give them real hell and a lot of propaganda, leaflets, whatever, to tell them, listen, you are encircled, you are bottled up, you have to surrender. This is a moment when things will start to deteriorate. And I don't think that these guys are going to fight to the death. Absolutely not. You'll have whole formations giving themselves up. However, you need to create this situation, and perhaps to continue, it will take some time, but then to continue the heavy bombardment. Eventually, you'll have, I think you have an excellent chance to have many prisoners of war.
Let's turn to the Scud missiles. We had another one in Israel just last night, even after the deadline had expired. What now, given your knowledge of Saddam Hussein, would be his propensity to fire more Scud missiles at Israel and chemical warheads, if he has them?
Well, conventional missiles, I think he'll do as much as he can. Well, he's got problems, of course. We can see that, technical problems and operational problems. But he'll try to do as much as he can. As for chemical weapons, I can put it this way. It's possible, but it's not an easy decision for him. Because he believes, at least that's the Iraqi approach. I'm not saying this is the Israeli approach, but this is the Iraqi approach, the strategic outlook, that if they use against us chemical weapons, we are very likely to use against them atomic weapons. Now, I don't think that Saddam Hussein will do it lightly, but when pushed to the wall, I would expect that if he does have chemical warheads to his missiles, of which we are not 100% sure, he may very well use them.
Thank you very much, Professor Amatzia Baram. Now back to you, Jonathan Mann in Atlanta.
Richard Blystone, thanks very much for that.
Before the ground war began in earnest, U.S. Marines have been steadily increasing the intensity of their preliminary attacks on Iraqi positions. And Allied bombers have been blasting targets in Baghdad. CNN's Peter Arnett in the Iraqi capital reported that huge explosions were heard much earlier in the night, Baghdad time.
It is now about 20 to 9 in the morning in Baghdad, and CNN's Christiane Amanpour is standing by live there with the latest. Christiane?
Jonathan, just a few moments ago, there was an air raid siren, and after that, we heard the muffled sound of what appears to be bombs falling in the distance. However, that's the first sign of any activity we've had over the last few hours. The last thing we did have here was on the dot of 8 o'clock, the deadline, 8 p.m. local time, the deadline set by the United States. And the Allies, we did have a huge fireball, several bombs dropping over this area, but that was the latest. As for information today, Baghdad is very quiet. There has been nothing in the local press, obviously, and nothing on Baghdad radio. The only thing that we're getting on Baghdad radio is the Quran, prayers being said and parts of the Quran being read. So the people here, unless they're listening to international broadcasts and shortwave radio, have not yet woken up to the fact that the war has apparently gone into its next phase. It is quiet over here. The last thing we heard from President Saddam Hussein was that he was chairing a meeting of the Revolutionary Command Council yesterday to discuss the latest developments in the Gulf. The last thing we heard in terms of political response last night was from the vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, who was fairly defiant, who basically rejected the United States ultimatum, saying that although Iraq wanted peace, the ultimatum was not realistic militarily and that they couldn't accept it. That is the latest from here. So far, it's very quiet. We've not yet had a chance to go out on the streets. We will be doing so soon to talk to people, find out what their feelings are. As I say, no sign of any military activity from Baghdad, and we're not allowed to go anywhere near lines or supply routes or anything else, so I can't tell you what kind of activity is going on near the front. I'm Christiane Amanpour, CNN, reporting live from Baghdad.
Christiane, I know we're having communication problems right now, but if you can hear me and make out what I'm saying, obviously the people of Iraq are used to not knowing everything about what their government is up to, but I imagine on a day like today, with the deadline passed, the kind of ignorance they are now being held in has got to be particularly difficult to endure. We're having a communication problem.
The official presidential announcement now nearly 3 hours ago that the U.S. has launched a ground offensive. CNN's Charles Bierbauer has been standing by at the White House all day. Charles, what's the latest from there now?
Well, the latest is that most people here have gone to bed, and presumably the president is there now. We expect he'll be out in the morning, probably go to church, and then spend the rest of the day here at the White House keeping tabs on things as they move along in the Persian Gulf War. You know, Susan, one of the things that seems to fascinate journalists is what we call tick-tock here, who did what and when. So after President Bush had announced this new phase, the final phase he calls it, and after Secretary Cheney had his say, White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater filled in some of the gaps, only some. One of the points he indicated to us is that it was General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander over in Saudi Arabia of U.S. forces, who set the date and the time for the ground offensive, 8 p.m. on Saturday, the 23rd of February. The only thing that could have stopped that ground phase really would have been an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. The president had set the deadline himself for that last chance offer, the high noon Saturday opportunity for Iraq to start to move its forces. When the high noon deadline passed, General Schwarzkopf knew there was no reason to hold back on the land offensive. 2 hours after that began, at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, President Bush had returned to the White House to announce it.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Once again, this was a decision made only after extensive consultations within our coalition partnership.
All of this was in gear before the final week's flurry of diplomatic activities seeking a peaceful way out of Kuwait for Saddam Hussein. The Soviet initiative, which never really got going and probably had no chance of being accepted by the White House. In fact, Mr. Gorbachev called President Bush up at Camp David shortly before that noon deadline Saturday, asking for a 2-day delay to give the Iraqis more time, suggesting that perhaps the U.S. and the Soviets could merge their two plans. Mr. Bush was polite but firm, said the coalition's position was fixed. And Mr. Gorbachev was not, however, told of the time of battle. As for the last chance warning, how that came about, Mr. Fitzwater indicated to us that on Thursday night, the president was conferring with his senior military advisors. The Soviet offer was on the table, at least in Moscow, and the sense was that the U.S. ought to declare very firmly what its conditions were for an Iraqi withdrawal, and it was General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, according to Mr. Fitzwater, who said, well, let's lay a time out on the table, and then they'll know precisely what they have to do. The president did that Friday in the Rose Garden, telling Saddam Hussein he had to move by noon Saturday.
Without the agreement of the government of Iraq to meet demands of United Nations Security Council Resolution 660, as set forth in the specific terms spelled out by the coalition, to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait. To the contrary, what we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people.
Indeed, in the past day, we've heard concerns expressed here about a deteriorating situation inside Kuwait, what the White House calls the scorched earth policy of destroying the Kuwaiti oil apparatus, the oil fields and refineries, and also concerns about increasing atrocities, execution squads being led by Iraqi soldiers against Kuwaiti people. Susan?
Charles, you mentioned reporters' interest in who did what, where, and when. What and when. Where, of course, is another item of interest. Where are the key players right now? You mentioned that the president might be in bed, but where is the Secretary of State, the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
I can't speak for all of them. I can't really speak with the utmost authority for any of them. We're told the president did go back to the residence. He had been in the Oval Office after making that brief address at 10 o'clock Eastern Time Saturday night. He took a short walk around the South Grounds, a walk with Ranger, one of the dogs here, and then retired to the residence. As for the rest of them, well, they'll have to speak for themselves as to where they are. General Scowcroft seems to spend an awful lot of his time in his corner office at the White House and will probably be back there monitoring events throughout the day tomorrow and keeping President Bush apprised. That's about as much as I know on that score.
Thank you, CNN's Charles Bierbauer at the White House. Jonathan.
By any standard, it looks too late right now to end the conflict over Kuwait with a diplomatic solution, but there has been activity at the United Nations nonetheless. With more on that now, we go live to CNN's Jeannie Most. Jeannie?
The UN Security Council meeting tonight broke up with several ambassadors making angry, at times sarcastic statements to the press, statements that brought strong responses from the U.S. and the British ambassadors. The council was supposed to meet behind closed doors to talk about trying to merge the Soviet plan and the U.S. plan to end the war, but instead the ground war began. In response, Iraq's deputy ambassador said that Iraq would never surrender, and Kuwait's ambassador said his people would soon smell the fresh air of freedom. Here are their initial reactions, first Iraq, then Kuwait.
From what you've heard, though, how do you feel about the ground war beginning?
I think it will be a long war.
For only the sake of one intransigent leader, the world is paying dearly in order to preserve peace and security. We are sorry that we were not able to convince, the whole world was not able to convince Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait and to save his nation, his country, and the region, the catastrophe which he has brought.
Now, those comments came right before the Security Council met, but it didn't meet for long, just about a half an hour. As I said, they were supposed to talk about peace plans, but that was pointless given the ground war. Apparently, the members of the council agreed that they couldn't agree on what to do next. Yemen and Cuba, the ambassadors from those countries, were particularly upset. Inside the closed-door meeting, Yemen suggested that they all go home so that they didn't give the world the impression that they were actually doing something in there. Yemen's ambassador then stalked out of the meeting.
We think that there is no need for this ground war. It's unjustifiable. It's unnecessary. Nobody can say why on earth so many thousand people will have to die just because there's a disagreement on a few days in terms of withdrawal.
We spent the whole day in an exercise that was really a big joke, promoted by some people that knew that no peace was possible.
There are no further suggestions at this point as to what to do to implement the resolutions of the Council, although the Council is obviously determined to try to do that, despite the fact that a couple of more disruptive members have tried to denigrate from the role of the Council.
I would not say, like others, that it was a sad day for the United Nations. I would say, like myself, that it is a remarkably sad day for the people of Iraq.
The Council is eclipsed at this point.
I think that the Council may go on vacation.
People often come out of the Security Council and say that when they haven't had their own way.
Even at the UN Security Council, peace was elusive tonight. I'm Jeannie Mose reporting live from the United Nations.
Our coverage of the war in the Gulf continues. I'm Jonathan Mann.
And I'm Susan Rook. Now we take you live to the Pentagon for the very latest there.
Pentagon officials described the ground operation as massive, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of fast-moving tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces. And they say the air war is not only continuing, but it will actually accelerate with what military planners describe as a surge of tactical sorties designed to destroy Iraq's remaining tanks and other heavy equipment.
This phase of the combined air, land, and sea campaign has been carefully planned to force Iraq out of Kuwait with a minimum number of casualties to Allied forces.
Reports that reached the Pentagon during the first hours of the operation said it was moving ahead quickly and successfully, but at that point, Cheney cautioned that the Allies would have to be prepared for stiff resistance.
I would not say that there is minimal risk. This is a major military operation against a well-equipped, well-fortified opponent. I would not want to underestimate the difficulties of the task at all.
Citing concerns over operational security, the Pentagon has imposed an extraordinary news embargo, at least for this initial stage of the ground offensive.
Even the most innocent-sounding information could be used directly against the men and women whose lives are on the line carrying out these operations. We cannot permit the Iraqi forces to know anything about what we're doing.
The commander of Operation Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf, was given authorization to begin the ground offensive even in advance of Saturday's high noon deadline. Cheney said the operation could have been halted if the Iraqis had accepted President Bush's final conditions.
Saddam Hussein had come into compliance with the deadline, had announced by noon today that he was prepared to withdraw unconditionally his forces from Kuwait, then we would have stopped preparations for an execution of the operation.
But that deadline came and passed, and Schwarzkopf gave the final orders to move only hours later. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, reporting live from the Pentagon.
Thank you, Wolf. Jonathan?
We go now to Baghdad, where CNN's Christiane Amanpour is standing by live with the latest. Christiane?
Good morning, Jonathan. Here in Baghdad, you would hardly know that anything had happened. You certainly wouldn't know that the ground offensive has started. We have had an air raid in the last half an hour and heard a few distant thuds, but nothing major. The last major thing we heard was at about 8 p.m. local, our time here sharp, when there was a huge bomb raid, one of the biggest in the last few days. But that's all we've heard. As far as the local press, it's obviously not in the newspapers and on Baghdad radio, which we've been monitoring this morning, and particularly right now at the top of this hour, just routine news, nothing about the ground offensive, condemning the regular condemnations of civilian casualties and that kind of thing. So it is very quiet here at the moment.
Do you get any sense from the people of Baghdad, if you've had a chance to talk to them, I don't know, but if you have had a chance, any sense about how they feel about the deadline at least having been passed?
Yes, I mean, we have not been able to go out yet today. As you know, we're under some restrictions. We will be doing that soon. The feeling yesterday was that this was the last chance. Now that the deadline had passed, they had pinned a lot of hopes on that deadline. Obviously, everybody we talked to, nobody wants war. However, they were saying that if it's to happen, it will happen. The feeling here was that the Iraqis had given as much as they could give without facing a total political humiliation anyway, and people the people we talked to, some of the people we talked to were saying, well, if it has to happen like this, it will happen, and that, you know, expressing the usual confidence in the strength of their forces. What you can hear right now...
We can hear you speak, Christiane, so if you're hearing me, please go ahead if you can.
What you're hearing right now is the all clear. As I said, there was an air raid warning about half an hour ago, and now you're hearing the all clear.
Just to make that clear for our audience, that's the all clear. Was there any unusual activity in the skies when the air raid siren came out? Was there anything that you could see in the city that looked at all unusual this morning?
Absolutely not at all. As I say, it was very, very quiet this morning. We woke up to international broadcasts announcing that the ground offensive had started, and there was no unusual activity. As I say, being here, you wouldn't have known it had happened.
Any sign of Saddam Hussein?
I'm sorry?
Any sign of Saddam Hussein, if you can hear me?
No sign at all. The last thing we heard was a radio broadcast yesterday that said he had chaired a meeting of the Revolutionary Command Council to discuss the latest developments in the Gulf. The last time we actually heard his voice was about 2 days ago when he made a speech the night before the deadline came down. He made a speech. It was quite a defiant speech, a speech saying that if war was to come, Iraq would fight it, and that was the last thing we've heard from him.
Now, you're trying to operate, of course, under relatively strict censorship that we all know about. Do you get any impression, do the censors that you're working with, the information ministry people, if that's who they are, do they know that their country is now under land attack, and have they responded in any way?
They do know. They've been listening to shortwave radio. They've been listening to the international broadcast. The people over here know that it has happened, and you know, a lot of them have been expressing a sort of fatalistic, well, we thought it would happen. I mean, a lot of people felt that way last night after the deadline, after the Iraqi acceptance of the Soviet proposal for an unconditional withdrawal was rejected as not going far enough. People here had basically come to the realization that this was it.
Does the fact that they're not being told anything, do you think that will end up making people more nervous than they might otherwise be, or are they just used to the war going on and not hearing much, in fact, about its progress?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. They're fairly used to it. It's not unusual for Baghdad radio to hold off on this kind of announcement. It's not the kind of place where you get immediate bulletins. Presumably, the government is trying to formulate its response, and when it's good and ready to deliver some kind of news, that will be conveyed over the radio. But the people here are fairly used to the kind of sparse information that does come out of official channels on occasions like this, and they resort, like the rest of us do, to international broadcasts.
Now, there's great optimism here on this side by many people that now that the ground war has begun, that the conclusion is relatively close, a few days, perhaps a few weeks, and the conclusion is relatively certain. Is confidence ebbing away there, or are people more confident than they were that Iraq will win this?
The rhetoric you hear, the people were, are very proud here. They're certainly not going to say that they're going to be overrun or humiliated in a few days. They say that their brave forces will fight, that their brave forces will inflict heavy losses. However, when you talk to people privately, off camera, quite a few of them have said to me that it will be a short war, and from what they say, I gather they don't mean because they think Iraq will win.
What about the possibility still in the very distant future, or certainly in the realm of speculation at this point, that the Allied coalition gets into Iraq, that it goes further than Kuwait? Is it going to face a very different reality militarily and politically if it tries that kind of thing, do you think?
I can't give you any official sort of word on that. All I can say is that, repeat the kind of things that have been said over the last few days, and that is that people here, as you've heard us report, a lot of people here have said they believe that the Allies have more than Kuwait on their mind and they want the destruction of this country. That's what the people here say. Now, whether they think that there's going to be a massive invasion into Iraq, that's what they're saying, is that they think it may or may not happen.
And the simple fear of ordinary people, is that increasing, or is it business as usual and the dreary and horrible business of war goes on?
That sort of feeling was increasing over the last few days, particularly, I mean, we were on a really sort of seesaw balance here. Would the ultimatum, would the deadline pass without a response? Would Iraq's acceptance of what amounts to a surrender, Iraq's acceptance of an unconditional withdrawal according to the Soviet peace proposal, would that be accepted? I think people were feeling the more they gave and the more it was rejected, people were feeling that the Allies wanted a war, wanted a ground attack, wanted to see the destruction of Iraq no matter what. That, as I say, is the feeling from people here.
Do they feel isolated? Do they feel that countries such as Jordan make it, the support of Jordan make it more or less an even battle, or does it look to them like one country against the world?
I think it looks like to them as one country against the world. They have repeatedly said to us on the streets in the last few days that whatever happens, it will be a victory for Iraq, because what they say is that they have stood up to, as they put it, they've stood up to a coalition of about 30 forces, 30 nations arrayed against them. They say that by simply standing up and getting through it this far, by withstanding and not buckling, that they've already won at least a sort of moral victory. That's what the people we've been talking to have said here. Obviously, we don't talk to everybody. We talk to a sort of handful of people every day, and that's the kind of thing we're being told.
Well, as you can imagine, it certainly seems President Bush's strategy, the strategy of the coalition, is to humiliate Saddam Hussein, make it so that there is no possible way he could claim a victory from whatever the result of the land battle is. It seems from what you're saying, though, that in the eyes of his own people, no matter what happens, he will have achieved some kind of victory.
Well, I can't tell you what they're going to say today or in the next few days once information about the ground war comes in. But over the last few days, they've been saying that no matter what happens, at that point they expected, or they were thinking, that Iraq might withdraw. They were saying no matter what happens, the fact that we've stood up so far, for us at least, is some kind of a victory.
CNN's Christiane Amanpour reporting to us live from Baghdad. Thanks very much for that.
And Ahrens, according to Israeli radio, was notified that the actual ground war was delayed some so that the Allies could divert some of their air power to controlling the Scud launchers and perhaps minimizing the effect of the Scud threat on Israel and on Saudi Arabia. We understand that Israel was, of course, thankful for that. Some quick headlines around the country here. The civil defense authorities have said it is okay for the schools to open in this country. Remember, when the war broke out in the middle of January, the schools were closed here because of the threat of Scud attacks from Israel. That threat proved real. However, the civil defense authorities say day by day they will decide. Today the schools are open. They are urging folks to hang on to their gas masks and keep them close at hand because, as Saddam Hussein has threatened, the risk of chemical warfare is perhaps higher than ever now. A tight curfew has been clamped once again on the occupied territories here. 1.75 million Palestinians and Arabs, residents of the occupied territories, Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, have been told to stay at home. The Israeli Defense Forces are very concerned that there might be Palestinian demonstrations, perhaps some riots, that would divert the attention of the Israeli authorities away from keeping track of the war. Right now, Israel's role in this war is strictly on the sidelines, watching and waiting. Greg Lefebvre, CNN, reporting live from Jerusalem.
Even now, Iraq is not without friends. One country that is remaining friendly is Jordan. We go now to Jordan's capital, Amman, where Tony Clark is standing by. Tony?
Jonathan, it was 3 in the morning Jordan time when the ground war began, so it caught most people here in this country asleep through those first hours of fighting. Government officials were up, though, and they were monitoring news of the fighting on radio and television reports. There was no official comment from either the Royal Palace or Jordan's Ministry of Information. Shortly after dawn and after the morning prayers at Jordan's mosques, word that the ground fighting had begun spread quickly.
On the streets of Amman this morning, there was a feeling both of inevitability and anger. The ground fighting has been expected. And there's also the expectation that Iraq will win.
I don't know why the soldier of the United States came here in the Gulf countries. For what? It's not their land.
They better get the hell out of there, the U.S., and die. Otherwise, they will get on the service. They will be chopped up in the desert. It's not their business. They better pack their bags and go home.
Even if Bush will succeed in this battle, but it will not stop. The war will continue, and he is losing at the end, and the Yankees will be killed thousands and thousands and thousands.
A poll released yesterday in Jordan shows a majority of people here think the ground war will be long and Iraq will win.
Despite the strong feelings here in Amman, the strong pro-Iraqi feelings, there have not yet been any demonstrations here in Jordan. Yesterday, the Jordanian police did block off the road that leads in front of the U.S. Embassy here in Amman as a precaution in case there was an attempt to demonstrate in front of the embassy. There was no such demonstration. This morning, that road is open, but there are a couple of truckloads of Jordanian riot police that are standing by a couple of blocks away just in case something would happen. Again, that's just a precaution at this point. All the feelings, all the angers is just felt just on the streets as you talk to people, but not expressed in any demonstrations. I'm Tony Clark, CNN, reporting live from Amman.
Colonel, you have participated in night fighting. Can you give us, the non-military people in the audience, a sense of what is going on now as it is mid-morning in the Middle East?
Well, night fighting has really progressed over the last 5 or 6 years. I would say that our forces are at a great advantage during the nighttime for the simple reason of all the mechanisms and all the optical equipment they have, which obviously puts the Iraqis at a disadvantage. For instance, looking at through night sights, whether it's the tanks or whether it's the various weapon systems, one sees sort of a green day, like a fuzzy green day, and if we realize the last pick-off by the helicopters, it was used as a lot of this night equipment. So they're at a distinct disadvantage. That's the Iraqis. We're at an advantage, and that's why I think we made the move last night.
Colonel, does that advantage decrease in any sense during the day?
Well, the advantage of night, obviously, because they can see us and we can see them during the day. And the only advantage we have during the day would be our superior weapon systems, our technology, and that sort of thing.
We have heard so much about the Iraqi defense system. Can you talk a little bit about that? And we have seen in the last couple of days, the Allies have been cutting through the defensive system. How will that work, and how effective is that Iraqi defense perimeter, that 10 to 12 mile perimeter? How dangerous is that?
Well, I would say, let's say a month ago, very, very dangerous. But since the air campaign, not as dangerous, but yet it's formidable. However, we have the systems to cut through it and penetrate quickly. The other dimension is that the morale of the Iraqi forces are very low, and certainly the first few lines will rack up pretty well until we get to the Revolutionary Guards. And one has to realize that the war will be on every front. We know that the Corps has moved over to the, let's say, to the west, and are flanking and going towards the Revolutionary Guards. The Marines are moving up the coastline. On their left flank are the British, the French, and the Saudis. And so everything's going to be at once. We have sophisticated equipment to knock out the razor-type wire, their minefields, and I think we'll breach it rather quickly. And like I said before, because of the morale of the Iraqi troops, I expect them to be rolled up fairly well within the first week, and really the ground campaign over in 3 weeks.